With President's Day right around the corner, I've decided to rank the presidents of the last 100 years, weighing heavy on a liberty standpoint and how their policies have shaped America for good or bad. I'm not including Biden since he hasn't completed a term yet, but it's not looking good for him. So let's get started from worst to first. Trump. He claims to always be winning, and here he is winning the worst president in a century. And that's pretty literal because the only other president I would rank worse is Woodrow Wilson, 101 years ago. His tax cuts did help boost the economy temporarily, but after that, everything went downhill. Deficit spending increased the national debt by 20%. He was a fan of red flag laws, significantly increased drone strikes, bungled the COVID response, emboldened the Taliban, had questionable leadership during the 2020 summer riots, and then his attack on democracy after losing the 2020 election. But hey, what do you expect from a twice impeached president? Before Trump threw the match on partisan politics, Obama was the one pouring fuel on it. Obama did help the economy recover after the 07-08 recession and ended a moratorium on drilling, but he ushered in policies centralizing power, raised Social Security taxes, had tobacco regulations, the Benghazi fiasco, and he consolidated more executive power, which was abused by Trump and Biden and will no doubt continue on. The charismatic orator knew how to glaze over the bad, though. Tricky Dick set the standard for authoritarian presidencies. His paranoia led him to all kinds of corruption, including the biggie, Watergate. The only thing positive is him ending the Vietnam War, most likely out of political and public pressure though. But his creation of the DEA and the war on drugs led to millions of cases of over-policing, wrongful prosecutions, skyrocketing incarcerations, and questionable and coincidental targeting of minorities. Those are just attacks on liberties. He also impacted our pocketbooks by removing the U.S. from the gold standard, freezing prices and wages, and added a 10% import tax. All that dominates the small good things he did, namely reducing the national debt by 70%. W ushered in the new millennium with promise, even after the hanging Chad. But then the unimaginable happened. And that's where our liberties and freedom were hijacked in favor of safety. The U.S. Patriot Act was probably the most intrusive act against individual liberty ever signed. That alone lands him this low. The creation of Homeland Security, No Child Left Behind, Hurricane Katrina, numerous bailouts, and the attempted coup in Venezuela all keep him here. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me, you can't get fooled again. Truman is another one of those presidents that was overshadowed by war. In this case, the end of the greatest war and the start of one still technically going on. And the use of the atomic bomb twice will always be debated on if it would have saved American lives, or how long the war would have continued without it. But regardless, the dropping of those bombs killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians, and he even threatened to use it later on. And he implemented the Truman Doctrine in hopes to contain communism, but let's call it what it was, the catalyst for decades of behind-the-scenes meddling in foreign affairs. Add the creation of the CIA, that pesky Korean War, government seizures of railroads and steel, and you almost forget he integrated the military. The conservative savior, the Gipper, the actor. And those acting skills sure did hide a lot. Most remember the bustling economy of the 80s, those good old Reaganomics. After the lean years of Carter, it was a relief. But behind that was a tripling national debt, increased government regulations, a failed war on drugs, increased Social Security taxes, the Iran-Contra scandal, an intrusive government involvement in foreign affairs, and just plain destabilization seeking in Libya, Grenada, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Lebanon. But above all that, he stuck it to the USSR. We read his lips, and there were new taxes. Senior Bush rode Reagan's coattails of popularity right into the White House. He continued all those bad policies, added taxes, and continued increased spending. Oh, and there was that war in the Persian Gulf. He was there for the minor recession, rise in oil prices, and completely missed on the AIDS response. He was Diet Reagan, without the likability, so it's only fitting he again follows Reagan on this list. How can one of the most treasured presidents of all time land this low on any presidential list? Well, FDR was one of those populist presidents, much like Reagan. But he might be the president responsible for the single most expansion of executive power and influence. Like W, a war glazed over much of their policies. And much like W, using the 9/11 attacks to push the Patriot Act, FDR used the Great Depression to usher in sweeping recovery and public works acts. What was started by Wilson, FDR grew the government like a lot. Let's not forget the cringy internments of German, Italian, and Asian Americans. But thanks to his 4 terms, term limits were established. So let's drink to that, since he also ended Prohibition. There's not a lot to say about the guy who oversaw the Great Depression. There are always contributing factors that lead to economic collapse, and Hoover can't be completely to blame, but he was extremely slow to react, and was so far removed from the public he didn't even grasp the severity of it. And when he did finally respond, there were just bailouts and price controls. But he did have things named after him like Hoovervilles, which is not a great honor. And even the Hoover Dam was actually signed to start building by Coolidge before him. So how does he make it this high? Well, the ones before were just worse. And just like guacamole, bland on his own, it's everything around him that gives him flavor, good or bad. Now we're really starting to get into the presidents that are really hit and miss with balancing their policies with liberty. LBJ completely embodies that bipolar approach. On one end, he signed in the Freedom of Information Act, expanded voting rights, put a dent in Jim Crow laws, and signed the Civil Rights Act. All of that would normally be a champion for individual liberty. But then there was the Vietnam War. JFK had decided to bring what troops we had deployed back home. LBJ swiftly reversed that and lied to America about the Gulf of Tonkin incident to continue that war effort. This led to needless deaths of American soldiers. We have to go all the way back to the beginning of this 100 years to get where we're at now. Harding exuded cronyism, lined his cabinet with unqualified members, was wrought with scandals, had extramarital affairs, and catered to the rich, and was on his way to impeachment had he not died. So how is he this much higher than Trump? Well, he did end the First Great War, cut spending and taxes, pardoned Wilson's political prisoners, supported African Americans, and set policies that helped lead to the Roaring '20s, all after the wake of a Spanish flu outbreak. This all sounds eerily similar. The remaining presidents are surprising, even for me, starting with this guy. Clinton was the OG to Obama's presidency. Charismatic, a great speaker, and personable. Just enough to mask the deficiencies. But Clinton was the last president to chair a balanced budget, signed the Taxpayer Relief Act, and was heavily involved in the nuclear test ban. Though he never got us into any major military conflict, there were a lot of small interventions like Mogadishu, Rwanda, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, and Haiti that tarnish any perceived peaceful presidency. But according to him, he did not have military relations with those countries. So, JFK was killed too early, and some speculate that his anti-CIA approach is what did him in. He kept us out of an all-out nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, worked to abolish nuclear weapons, worked toward ending segregation, sort of, other than wiretapping Martin Luther King Jr. He had to deal with more national strife in his shortened term than most do in 8 years, and kept it cool and inspiring. Honestly, I'm as shocked as you are. When you think about the state of the nation during his time, it's nothing but gas shortages and strife economic years. Throw in the mishandling of the Iran hostage crisis, and you see why he normally resides at the bottom of most lists. But he's starting to get a resurgence of sorts. His deregulations on oil prices and telecommunications, extreme scale back on the war on drugs, which was unfortunately short-lived and ramped up years later. He legalized marijuana, also short-lived, lifted bans on home brewery, ended the occupation of the Panama Canal, and those lean economic years are now being realized in helping the economic boost of the 80s. His genuine character was taken advantage of, but this guy deserves a second look. Not only was Eisenhower a war hero, but he used that to keep our troops out of conflict. And if it wasn't for the McCarthyism on his watch, and the blurring of separation of church and state, all out of fear of communism spreading, he'd probably be at the top of my list. His character and leadership far exceed all of those on this list. He started the civil rights movement, ended the Korean War, protected the integration of schools, privatized public assets, cut taxes, warned of war in the American military complex. What can I say? I like Ike. Another shocker. How can a guy that became a president without even being elected to the ticket make it this high? Well, if you haven't noticed with the last two, character weighs heavy with me, and Ford was another genuine guy. And after the debacle of Nixon, Ford was what the country needed. He helped create the Human Rights Watch, signed the Tax Reduction Act in 1975, exposed and limited CIA activities, well, until Reagan anyway, scaled back on the war on drugs, was aggressive toward energy independence with fossil and green fuels, including nuclear power, legalized private ownership of gold, and protected women's rights. If it weren't for his support of the Indonesian invasion of East Timor that resulted in genocide, he could be number one. And that's just strange to say. Silent Cal exudes what a hands-off president is, and was the facilitator of the Roaring '20s. He despised government regulation and worked hard to scale it back. America had a budget surplus. He cut taxes, saw no inflation, and maintained low unemployment. He granted Native Americans citizenship and supported civil rights and anti-lynching laws. He balanced anti-war with a strong national defense. And he cleaned up the corruption left by Harding. In all, he believed the president should not be a driving force for policy and regulation, and left that to the legislators, and understood the immense influence that the position held. And because of that, always acted in reserve in any presidential action. And you can't say that about any other president. And there you have it. My ranking of the last 100 years of our presidents. Each one has their good and bad traits and policies, and we haven't, nor probably ever will, have the perfect president. Though Coolidge was close, from a libertarian perspective anyway, and he often gets overlooked and underappreciated. The important thing to remember is that every president should be held accountable, and none void of criticism, especially those we voted for. Now get out there and take advantage of those President Day sales, if there's anything in stock, or if it's affordable.